In the shadowed corridors of medieval France, where honor and horror walked hand in hand, lived a man whose name would echo through centuries as both hero and monster. Gilles de Rais stands as one of history's most perplexing figures, a decorated war hero who fought alongside Joan of Arc, yet was accused of committing some of the most heinous crimes imaginable against innocent children. His story challenges everything we think we know about good and evil, power and corruption, truth and fabrication. The year was 1440, when the great Baron de Rais met his end at the gallows, confessing to crimes so grotesque that chroniclers struggled to record them. Yet today, nearly 6 centuries later, historians question whether this man was truly the monster history painted him to be, or whether he was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy designed to strip him of his vast wealth and lands. This is not merely a tale of medieval brutality, it is a complex web of politics, power, and the dangerous game of accusations that could destroy even the mightiest noble. To understand the man who would be called the original Blue Beard, we must first journey to the France of the early 15th century, a nation torn apart by war, plague, and political upheaval. In this world of shifting loyalties and desperate struggles for survival, Gilles de Rais emerged as a shining example of chivalric ideals, only to fall into darkness so profound that his name became synonymous with evil itself. But was this darkness real, or was it a shadow cast by those who sought to bring down a man too powerful for his own good? The evidence presents a puzzle that has confounded historians for generations, leaving us to wonder, can we ever truly know the heart of a man who lived and died 600 years ago? The story of Gilles de Rais is more than a medieval mystery. It is a mirror reflecting our own struggles with justice, truth, and the corrupting influence of power. As we delve into the life and alleged crimes of this enigmatic figure, we must ask ourselves, how do we separate fact from fiction when both are equally terrifying? In the castle chambers where children allegedly screamed their last breaths, in the court records that documented confessions extracted under threat of torture, in the modern scholarly debates that challenge centuries of accepted truth, we find a story that refuses to be easily categorized. This is the story of Gilles de Rais, hero, villain, or victim of his times. The truth, as we shall see, may be far more complex and disturbing than any simple tale of good versus evil. For in the case of Gilles de Rais, the line between justice and conspiracy, between guilt and innocence, becomes as blurred as the mists that once shrouded his ancestral castles in the Loire Valley. Born into nobility around 1404, Gilles Demon Moroni Laval Baron de Rais entered a world where violence and refinement coexisted with startling ease. His family controlled vast territories in Brittany and Anjou, making him one of the wealthiest men in France, even before he reached adulthood. The de lineage was ancient and proud, tracing their bloodline back to the earliest days of French nobility, and young Gilles was raised with the expectation that he would uphold the family's honor and expand their influence. The France of Gilles' youth was a nation in agony. The 100 Years' War had been raging for decades, with English forces occupying large portions of French territory. The country was divided with different noble factions supporting competing claimants to the throne. Into this chaos came a peasant girl named Joan of Arc, claiming divine visions that commanded her to drive the English from French soil and see the Dauphin Charles crowned as the rightful king. When Joan arrived at the court of Charles VII in 1429, the 25-year-old Gilles de Rais was already a seasoned warrior, with a reputation for both courage and cruelty in battle. His wealth allowed him to maintain a personal army, and his tactical skills had earned him the rank of Marshal of France, an extraordinary honor for someone so young. The meeting between Joan and Gilles would prove to be one of the most significant encounters in both their lives. Gilles became one of Joan's most devoted supporters and closest military companions. He fought beside her at the Siege of Orléans, where French forces achieved a stunning victory that marked the beginning of the end for English domination in France. Contemporary accounts describe Gilles as a magnificent figure on the battlefield, resplendent in gilded armor and leading charges with seemingly supernatural fearlessness. The partnership between the mystical peasant girl and the wealthy baron captured the imagination of their contemporaries. Joan represented divine inspiration and pure faith, while Gilles embodied the martial prowess and financial resources necessary to translate vision into victory. Together, they seemed unstoppable, driving English forces from one stronghold after another in a campaign that would become the stuff of legend. But even in these days of glory, there were those who whispered about Gilles' darker tendencies. Some noted his apparent fascination with the more brutal aspects of warfare, his tendency to take unnecessary risks that bordered on the suicidal, and his lavish spending on luxuries that seemed to serve no practical purpose. These early warning signs would later be interpreted as evidence of the corruption that was allegedly already taking root in his soul. The bond between Jean and Gilles was tested by fire in the crucible of war, and it seemed to emerge stronger than ever. When Joan was captured by Burgundian forces and sold to the English, Gilles was among those who attempted to negotiate her release. Her subsequent trial and execution by burning in 1431 marked the end of their partnership and, according to some historians, the beginning of Gilles' descent into the abyss that would ultimately consume him. The death of Joan of Arc in 1431 marked a turning point not just in the 100 Years' War, but in the life of Gilles de. Those who knew him claimed that something fundamental changed in the young marshal after he witnessed his companion's execution. The man who had once channeled his violent impulses into the service of France now seemed to turn those same impulses inward toward increasingly dark and private pursuits. With the war winding down and his military services no longer in constant demand, Gilles retired to his vast estates scattered across Brittany and Anjou. His wealth was legendary even by the standards of the medieval nobility. He owned dozens of castles, thousands of acres of land, and commanded the loyalty of countless vassals. Yet, despite this immense fortune, Gilles began spending money at a rate that alarmed even his closest advisors. His expenditures were as extravagant as they were puzzling. He maintained a private chapel with a choir of dozens of young boys, paying them salaries that far exceeded what such positions typically commanded. He commissioned elaborate theatrical productions that cost fortunes to stage, often playing roles himself in performances that combined religious themes with disturbing elements that made observers uncomfortable. The young men who served in Gilles' household began to notice troubling changes in their master's behavior. He would disappear for days at a time into the lower levels of his castles, emerging pale and agitated. A strange odor began to emanate from certain chambers that had previously been used for storage, and servants reported hearing sound screaming, chanting, and other noises they could not identify coming from these sealed areas. Gilles also began surrounding himself with a new circle of advisors and companions, men whose reputations were far from savory. Chief among these was Francesco Prolati, an Italian cleric who claimed expertise in alchemy and the occult arts. Prolati convinced Gilles that his financial troubles could be solved through the summoning of demons who would provide unlimited gold in exchange for certain services. The transformation was not immediate, but rather a gradual erosion of the moral foundations that had once guided the hero of Orléans. Servants noticed that Gilles became increasingly interested in children, particularly young boys between the ages of 6 and 18. He would send his agents throughout the countryside to recruit these children for his household, ostensibly as pages or choir members. But many of these children were never seen again. Local families began to whisper among themselves about the disappearances. A blacksmith's son vanished after being invited to serve in the baron's household. A shepherd boy disappeared while delivering wool to one of Gilles' castles. The pattern was subtle at first, but as the years passed, the number of missing children grew to alarming proportions, and the whispers became increasingly difficult to ignore. By 1435, the whispers surrounding Gilles' deeds had grown into open accusations, though few dared voice them publicly. The baron's wealth and political connections provided him with a shield of protection that seemed impenetrable. However, the sheer volume of disappearance children from villages across his domains simply vanishing without explanation began to create a pattern too obvious to ignore. The first concrete evidence of Gilles' alleged crimes came from the servants who worked in his closest confidence. These men, bound to their master by oaths of loyalty and terror in equal measure, began to share disturbing details about what they had witnessed in the sealed chambers of his castles. They spoke of rooms fitted with special drainage systems, of furnaces that burned at all hours, and of their master's increasing obsession with blood and death. According to later testimonies, Gilles had developed elaborate rituals surrounding the deaths of his victims. He would often dress in his finest robes, as if preparing for a religious ceremony before descending to the chambers where the children were held. The servants described hearing their master's voice, raised in what seemed to be prayers or incantations, followed by the screams of his victims. The physical evidence was equally damning. Servants reported discovering human remains in various states of decomposition throughout the castle grounds. Some spoke of rooms where severed heads were displayed like trophies, carefully preserved through unknown alchemical processes. Others described burial pits that were regularly filled and then emptied again, suggesting a systematic disposal of evidence. Francesco Pilati, the Italian cleric who had become Gilles' closest advisor, allegedly encouraged these activities as necessary components of the demon-summoning rituals they were attempting. Under his influence, Gilles came to believe that the blood of innocence was required to compel supernatural entities to appear and grant his wishes for unlimited wealth and power. The children who disappeared were reportedly selected based on specific criteria. G seemed to prefer boys who were particularly beautiful, or who possessed what he considered pure souls. They would be lured to his castles with promises of employment, education, or other opportunities that would seem attractive to families struggling with poverty. Once in Gilles' custody, these children would initially be treated well, fed fine foods, and dressed in expensive clothing. This period of kindness, according to survivor accounts, would last anywhere from days to weeks, allowing Gilles to study his victims and perhaps to heighten their terror when the inevitable end arrived. The psychological torture was apparently as important to him as the physical violence that followed. The methods by which Gilles allegedly tortured and murdered his victims were described in horrifying detail during his eventual trial. According to the confessions extracted from both Gilles himself and his accomplices, the Baron had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for extracting maximum suffering from his young victims, while prolonging their lives as long as possible. The torture chambers discovered in Gilles' castles were reportedly equipped with devices designed specifically for children. Smaller versions of traditional medieval torture instruments had been crafted to accommodate the bodies of victims ranging from 6 to 18 years of age. Iron hooks, heated brands, and cutting instruments were arranged with the precision of a physician's tools, suggesting that Gilles approached his dark work with the same methodical care he had once applied to military campaigns. Witnesses described how Gilles would often begin his sessions by simply talking to the children, asking about their families and their dreams for the future. This psychological component seemed to be crucial to his enjoyment of the process. He wanted his victims to understand what was about to happen to them, to experience the full weight of their hopelessness before the physical torture began. The actual methods of killing varied according to Gilles' mood and the specific requirements of whatever ritual he believed he was performing. Some children were strangled slowly, while Gilles washed their faces. Others were bled to death through carefully placed cuts designed to drain their blood into ceremonial vessels. The most disturbing accounts describe how Gilles would sometimes prolong the agony for hours or even days, keeping his victims alive through a combination of medical knowledge and sheer willpower. The preservation of body parts, particularly heads, was apparently another crucial element of Gilles' practices. Servants described rooms where dozens of severed heads were displayed on shelves, some fresh and others mummified through processes that Gilles had learned from his occult studies. He would reportedly spend hours in these chambers, speaking to the preserved remains as if they could still hear and respond to him. The disposal of evidence was handled with military precision. Bodies were dismembered and burned in specially constructed furnaces, with the ashes scattered across the castle grounds or dumped into nearby rivers. Gilles maintained detailed records of his activities, keeping a kind of ledger that tracked the number of victims, their physical characteristics, and the specific manner of their deaths. Perhaps most chilling was the testimony that Gilles seemed to derive genuine pleasure from his actions. Witnesses described hearing him laugh during the torture sessions, and several accounts mention his habit of kissing and caressing the severed heads of his victims, while speaking to them in tender, loving tones, as if they were still alive and could appreciate his affection. For 8 long years, from 1432 to 1440, Gilles de allegedly continued his systematic murder of children while maintaining his public facade as a respected nobleman. His wealth and political connections provided him with protection from investigation, even as the number of missing children in his territories grew to staggering proportions. Local authorities, when they received complaints from grieving parents, found themselves powerless to act against someone of Gilles' status and influence. The Baron's financial resources allowed him to maintain a network of accomplices who helped him procure victims and dispose of evidence. These men, bound to their master through a combination of loyalty, fear, and complicity in his crimes, formed an effective barrier between Gilles and the outside world. They would travel throughout the countryside, identifying potential victims and luring them to the Baron's castles with promises that their families could not afford to refuse. During this period, Gilles also maintained his interest in the occult arts, continuing to work with Francesco Prolati and other practitioners in attempts to summon demons and achieve supernatural power. These rituals required an ever-increasing supply of innocent blood, which provided a theological justification for the murders that might otherwise have seemed purely sadistic. The scale of the operation was breathtaking in its scope and organization. Estimates suggest that as many as 800 children may have disappeared in the territories under Gilles' control during this 8-year period. While not all of these disappearances can be directly attributed to the Baron, the sheer number represents a demographic catastrophe that should have attracted immediate attention from higher authorities. Yet the feudal system that governed medieval France worked to Gilles' advantage. Local lords were essentially autonomous within their own territories, and the central royal authority had neither the resources nor the inclination to investigate crimes committed by one of their most powerful vassals. The king owed Gilles a debt of gratitude for his service during the war against England, and this relationship provided additional protection against inquiry. The families of the missing children found themselves in an impossible situation. To accuse a marshal of France of murder was tantamount to treason, yet their grief and desperation drove some to seek justice through whatever means were available to them. A few brave souls attempted to bring their concerns to religious authorities, hoping that the church might have the power to investigate where secular authorities would not. These attempts at seeking justice were systematically frustrated by Gilles' influence and the general unwillingness of authorities to believe such accusations against a war hero. The Baron's reputation as a companion of Joan of Arc provided him with a kind of moral armor that deflected suspicion even in the face of mounting evidence. The psychological toll on the communities under Gilles' control was enormous. Parents began keeping their children close to home, refusing to let them travel alone or accept employment opportunities that would take them far from family protection. The very social fabric of rural life was disrupted by the fear that any interaction with the Baron's representatives might result in the permanent loss of a child. The downfall of Gilles began not with an investigation into his alleged murders, but with a seemingly unrelated incident that demonstrated the arrogance and violent temper that had grown increasingly pronounced in his character. In May 1440, Gilles became embroiled in a dispute with the church over the sale of one of his properties, a conflict that would ultimately provide his enemies with the opening they needed to bring him to justice. The incident involved the church of Saint-Yend-de-Mer-Mort, which Gilles had sold to a local cleric without proper authorization from the Duke of Brittany, his feudal overlord. When church officials attempted to take possession of the property, Gilles responded with characteristic violence, leading an armed band to forcibly eject the priest and his supporters from the building. This assault on church property and personnel provided the Duke with a legal pretext to move against his increasingly troublesome vassal. Duke Jean V of Brittany had grown concerned about Gilles' behavior and the rumors surrounding his activities. The Baron's extravagant spending had left him deeply in debt, and there were persistent whispers about the disappearances in his territories. The Duke may have also been motivated by the opportunity to seize Gilles' extensive lands and wealth, as the Baron had no legitimate heir, and his property would revert to ducal control upon his death or disgrace. The arrest came swiftly and without warning. On September 15th, 1440, Gilles was seized at his castle of Machecoul by forces loyal to the Duke of Brittany. Simultaneously, several of his closest accomplices, including Francesco Patti and his household servants, Henri Gris and Poitou, were taken into custody. The speed and coordination of these arrests suggested careful planning and possibly insider knowledge of Gilles' activities. The charges initially brought against Gilles focused on the assault on church property, but it quickly became clear that this was merely the opening move in a much larger legal strategy. Within days of his arrest, investigators began examining the Baron's castles and interviewing his servants. What they discovered in the sealed chambers and burial grounds provided evidence for charges far more serious than simple assault. The discovery of human remains throughout Gilles' properties transformed a relatively minor ecclesiastical dispute into one of the most sensational criminal cases of the medieval period. Investigators reportedly found hundreds of bodies in various states of decomposition, along with the preserved heads and other body parts that Gilles had allegedly kept as trophies of his crimes. The evidence was so overwhelming and so disturbing that even the hardened investigators struggled to document it properly. Chroniclers of the time wrote that the smell of death pervaded the castle of Machecoul so thoroughly that it took weeks to air out the building sufficiently for normal human habitation. The sheer scale of the carnage suggested systematic murder on a level that was almost incomprehensible to medieval minds. The political implications of the case were immediately apparent to all involved. Gilles D was not merely a nobleman, he was a marshal of France, a companion of Joan of Arc, and one of the most prominent figures in the recent victory over England. His disgrace would send shock waves throughout the French aristocracy and potentially damage the legitimacy of the very regime he had helped to establish. The trial of Gilles D began on October 13th, 1440, in the city of Nars, before an ecclesiastical court presided over by Bishop Jean de Molesto. The proceedings were unusual in that they combined both secular and religious charges, reflecting the complex nature of the accusations against the former Marshal of France. The Church claimed jurisdiction over the case due to the charges of heresy and invocation of demons, while secular authorities pursued charges of murder and assault. The prosecution's case was built primarily on physical evidence discovered at Gilles' castles and the testimony of his surviving servants. The evidence was so extensive and so horrifying that court scribes reportedly had difficulty recording the details without becoming physically ill. Investigators presented preserved body parts, blood-stained torture devices, and detailed accounts of the systematic murder of hundreds of children. The testimony of Gilles' accomplices provided the most damning evidence against their former master. Henri Gris and Poitou, facing torture and execution themselves, gave detailed accounts of their participation in the procurement, torture, and murder of victims. Their descriptions of Gilles' behavior during these sessions painted a picture of a man who had descended into complete moral madness, taking perverse pleasure in the suffering of innocent children. Francesco Prelati, the Italian cleric who had introduced Gilles to occult practices, provided testimony about the demonic rituals that had allegedly motivated many of the murders. He described elaborate ceremonies designed to summon supernatural entities, with the blood of children serving as payment for promised wealth and power. This testimony allowed the Church to pursue charges of heresy and devil worship, alongside the secular charges of murder. Initially, Gilles maintained his innocence and refused to acknowledge the authority of the court to try him. His aristocratic pride prevented him from submitting to what he considered the judgment of his social inferiors, and he seemed to have believed that his status as a Marshal of France would ultimately protect him from serious consequences. This arrogance proved to be a serious tactical error that cost him valuable time and sympathy. The turning point in the trial came when Gilles was threatened with excommunication and torture. The prospect of being cut off from the Catholic Church, which would condemn his soul to eternal damnation, finally broke through his aristocratic defiance. Faced with this spiritual threat, combined with the very real possibility of physical torture, Gilles agreed to confess to the charges against him. The confession that followed was unprecedented in its scope and detail. Speaking before the packed courtroom, Gilles admitted to the murder of hundreds of children, describing his methods and motivations with a clinical precision that shocked even the judges who had thought themselves prepared for his testimony. He expressed remorse for his actions, while simultaneously seeming to take a kind of perverse pride in the scale of his crimes. The confession included detailed descriptions of specific murders, the locations where bodies had been disposed of, and the elaborate rituals that had preceded many of the killings. Gilles also implicated his accomplices, confirming much of the testimony that had already been given against him, while adding new details that further demonstrated the systematic nature of his alleged crimes. The detailed confession of Gilles de Rais stands as one of the most disturbing documents to survive from the medieval period. Speaking in a clear, steady voice that betrayed no emotion, the former Marshal of France methodically described crimes so heinous that many in the courtroom wept openly as they listened to his words. His account was remarkable, not only for its horrifying content, but also for the clinical precision with which he described his methods and motivations. Gilles began his confession by acknowledging his debt to Francesco Prolati and the influence that the Italian cleric had exercised over his actions. He described how Prolati had convinced him that demonic forces could be summoned to restore his depleted fortune, but that these entities required payment in the form of innocent blood. What had begun as an attempt to solve his financial problems had gradually evolved into an obsession with the act of killing itself. The confession included detailed descriptions of how victims were selected and procured. Gilles admitted to sending his agents throughout his territories to identify suitable children, usually boys between the ages of 6 and 18, who possessed what he considered exceptional beauty or purity of soul. These agents would approach desperate families with offers of employment or education for their children, promises that the parents found impossible to refuse given their economic circumstances. Once the children were brought to his castles, Gilles described a pattern of behavior that combined kindness with psychological torture. He would initially treat his victims well, providing them with fine food and clothing, while explaining that they were privileged to serve in his household. This period of apparent benevolence would last for days or weeks, during which Gilles would study his victims and plan the specific manner of their deaths. The actual murders were described in horrifying detail that court scribes struggled to record accurately. Gilles spoke of his preference for manual strangulation, as it allowed him to watch the life drain from his victims' eyes, while maintaining physical contact with them throughout the process. He also described more elaborate torture sessions that could last for hours, during which he would inflict carefully calibrated pain while speaking to his victims in gentle, loving tones. Perhaps most disturbing was Gilles' description of his emotional response to these murders. He claimed to experience a form of religious ecstasy during the killings, believing that he was somehow communing with supernatural forces through the act of taking innocent life. The preservation of severed heads was described as a form of worship, with Gilles maintaining that the spirits of his victims continued to serve him even after death. The confession also revealed the extent to which Gilles' household had been organized around the facilitation of murder. He described a network of accomplices who helped him procure victims, dispose of evidence, and maintain the secrecy necessary for his activities to continue. These men were bound to him through a combination of loyalty, financial dependence, and complicity in his crimes. Throughout his confession, Gilles maintained that his actions had been motivated by supernatural compulsion rather than simple sadistic pleasure. He claimed that demonic forces had gradually taken control of his will, forcing him to commit acts that his rational mind recognized as evil. This explanation allowed him to express remorse while simultaneously distancing himself from full responsibility for his actions. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was sentenced to death by hanging, followed by burning to destroy his body completely. The sentence was pronounced by Bishop Jean de Melisto before a crowd that included nobles, clergy, and common people who had traveled from across France to witness the conclusion of one of the most sensational trials in medieval history. The former Marshal of France, who had once stood beside Joan of Arc as a hero of the realm, now faced the same fate that had befallen his sainted companion. The execution was scheduled for the afternoon of the same day, reflecting the court's desire to conclude the proceedings as quickly as possible. The authorities feared that delay might provide Gilles' remaining supporters with an opportunity to attempt a rescue, or that public sympathy might begin to shift in favor of a man whose confession had been so complete and seemingly sincere. The speed of the execution also served to demonstrate the efficiency of justice when applied to even the most powerful nobles. Gilles was led to the gallows erected in the meadow outside Nîmes. He was accompanied by a priest who had been assigned to hear his final confession and provide spiritual comfort in his last hours. The condemned man appeared calm and composed, showing none of the arrogance that had characterized his initial response to the charges against him. Some observers noted that he seemed almost relieved to be approaching the end of his ordeal. The execution itself was carried out with the efficiency typical of medieval justice. Gilles was hanged until dead, his body then cut down and placed upon a pyre that had been prepared nearby. However, in a gesture of mercy that reflected his former status and his apparent repentance, the authorities allowed his body to be removed from the flames before it was completely consumed, permitting his remains to be buried in consecrated ground. The crowd that witnessed the execution was enormous, with contemporary accounts suggesting that thousands of people had gathered to see the end of the Baron race. Many in the crowd were parents who had lost children in his territories, finally able to witness justice for crimes that had devastated their families. Others were simply drawn by morbid curiosity about one of the most notorious criminals of their age. Francesco Patti and the other accomplices were executed separately, their deaths far less ceremonious than that of their former master. The Italian cleric was hanged and burned completely, with his ashes scattered to prevent any possibility of creating relics from his remains. The household servants who had participated in the crimes met similar fates, bringing the entire conspiracy to a definitive end. The immediate aftermath of the executions saw a wave of relief throughout the territories that had been under Gilles' control. Parents who had lived in fear for their children's safety finally felt able to let them move freely through the countryside. The restoration of normal life was gradual, but the removal of the threat that had hung over these communities for 8 years marked the beginning of genuine healing. However, even as the bodies burned and the crowds dispersed, questions remained about the true extent of Gilles' crimes and the motivations of those who had brought him to justice. Some observers noted the convenient timing of his arrest, coming at a moment when his financial troubles had made him vulnerable to political manipulation. Others wondered whether a man of such refinement and education could truly have committed the barbaric acts to which he had confessed. In the centuries following the execution of Gilles de Rais, his case became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of evil, the reliability of medieval justice, and the dangers of concentrating too much power in the hands of any individual. His story was retold countless times, with each generation of chroniclers adding their own interpretations and embellishments to the basic facts of his life and crimes. The immediate historical impact of the case was profound, sending shockwaves through the French aristocracy and establishing new precedents for the prosecution of nobles accused of serious crimes. The fact that even a Marshal of France could be brought to justice demonstrated that no one was above the law, while the horrifying nature of the accusations served as a warning about the corrupting influence of absolute power during the Renaissance. Gilles' story became a popular subject for morality tales and literary works, that sought to explore the psychological mechanisms that could transform a hero into a monster. Writers and philosophers used his case to examine questions about the nature of evil, the role of supernatural influence in human behavior, and the relationship between power and moral corruption. The case also contributed to evolving attitudes towards children's rights and protection. The systematic nature of Gilles' alleged crimes against children helped to establish new legal precedents for prosecuting those who harmed minors, and his story became a powerful argument for the need to protect society's most vulnerable members from predatory adults. However, it was not until the 20th century that serious scholars began to question the historical accuracy of the charges against Gilles de. Modern historians, armed with new analytical tools and a deeper understanding of medieval legal procedures, started to examine the evidence with fresh eyes and reach some startling conclusions about the reliability of the case against the Baron. The first major challenge to the traditional narrative came in 1992, when a group of French historians conducted what they called a modern retrial of Gilles de, using contemporary legal standards and forensic analysis techniques. They examined the evidence that had been presented during the original trial and found it seriously wanting in several crucial areas. The modern investigation revealed significant problems with the physical evidence that had been used to convict Gilles. The locations where bodies had allegedly been discovered were found to be inconsistent with the testimony given at trial, and the methods used to preserve the supposed trophies were anachronistic for the 15th century. Most damning was the discovery that many of the key pieces of evidence had been discovered only after torture had been applied to Gilles' servants. The confessions themselves were found to contain internal contradictions and factual errors that suggested they had been coerced rather than freely given. The threat of excommunication and torture that had prompted Gilles to confess was found to constitute duress that would invalidate any confession under modern legal standards. Furthermore, the speed with which the trial had proceeded left little time for the defense to present alternative theories or challenge the prosecution's evidence. Perhaps most significantly, the modern investigation uncovered evidence of a systematic conspiracy to seize Gilles' lands and wealth. Documents found in various archives revealed that Duke Jean Fi of Brittany and other nobles had been planning to move against Gilles for months before the incident that provided the pretext for his arrest. The timing of the accusations coincided perfectly with Gilles' financial vulnerability, suggesting that his enemies had simply waited for the most opportune moment to strike. The 1992 retrial concluded that while Gilles de may indeed have been guilty of some crimes, the evidence presented at his original trial was insufficient to support the massive scale of accusations against him. The historians found it likely that he was the victim of a judicial conspiracy designed to eliminate a powerful rival and seize his property, with the horrifying charges serving as a pretext for what was essentially a political assassination. This modern reassessment of the case has profound implications for our understanding of medieval justice and the reliability of historical sources. It demonstrates how political motivations could corrupt even the most solemn legal proceedings, and how the passage of time could transform a probable injustice into accepted historical fact. The modern reassessment of Gilles forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of historical truth and the reliability of legal proceedings, even in our own time. If one of history's most notorious serial killers may have been the victim of a medieval frame-up, what does this tell us about our ability to distinguish between justice and persecution, between genuine evidence and convenient fabrication? The case serves as a powerful reminder that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the horror of alleged crimes should never excuse shortcuts in the pursuit of justice. The fact that accusations against Gilles were so monstrous may have actually worked against a fair trial, as judges and juries found it difficult to believe that such detailed confessions could be false. In our contemporary world, where media sensationalism and social media can rapidly transform accusations into accepted fact, the story of Gilles de offers crucial lessons about the importance of due process and the presumption of innocence. The speed with which his trial proceeded driven by public outrage and political convenience, mirrors troubling patterns we see in modern justice systems under pressure. The question of Gilles' guilt or innocence ultimately may be less important than what his case teaches us about power, justice, and the human capacity for both evil and self-deception. Whether he was a monster who preyed upon innocent children, or a powerful man destroyed by his enemies' machinations, his story reveals the fragility of the institutions we rely upon to protect us from injustice. The children who disappeared in his territories remained dead, regardless of whether Gilles killed them or whether they fell victim to other predators who operated in his shadow. The families who lost their sons and daughters suffered real grief that was not diminished by questions about who was ultimately responsible for their loss. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility raised by the modern reassessment is that the real killers, if they existed, may have escaped justice entirely, while Gilles faced execution for their crimes. The political conspiracy that may have destroyed an innocent man could have provided perfect cover for genuine predators to continue their activities without fear of discovery. The legacy of Gilles de Rais extends far beyond the medieval period in which he lived and died. His name became synonymous with child murder and sexual predation, inspiring countless works of fiction and serving as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power. Yet, if he was innocent of the crimes for which he died, then his legacy represents one of history's greatest miscarriages of justice. In the end, the story of Gilles de Rais, whether hero, monster, or victim, serves as a mirror reflecting our own fears about power, corruption, and the vulnerability of innocence in a world where justice is always imperfect and truth is often more complex than we dare to imagine. His tale forces us to confront the possibility that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the individuals accused of heinous crimes, but the systems and institutions we trust to protect us from evil.